Hey stragglers and tourists, my name is TheiPadCat and welcome to the 6th episode of my The Last of Us Could Have Been Very Different series, where we reconstruct and discuss one of the original storyboards from the game's development. If you just happen to come across this video, I'd strongly recommend watching this series in chronological order, because well, it probably won't make a lot of sense if you don't. In this episode, we reacquaint ourselves with a familiar face and finish the summer season. But let's not delay any further.
Let's get on with it.
The cold mountain breeze in combination with the slight rain was making Joel shudder. He and Ellie was walking along an old countryside road in Wyoming. After the events in Pittsburgh earlier in the summer, they'd found a car which greatly reduced the time of traveling from Pennsylvania to Wyoming. But a couple of dozen miles back, after an irreparable motor stop, they had to abandon it and continue on foot. Ellie sighed and complained about how hungry she was.
Oh, I'm so hungry.
Joel said that he was too, and that they'd need to look for food soon. A few hundred meters later, the road was blocked with a heap of dirt and rubble, presumably from a landslide happening sometime in the past. Barely visible under the dirt, Ellie spotted an old road sign. She went up to it and brushed it off with her shirt arm, thinking it might be a good way for them to get a better idea where they were. After a little while, she could make out the name Jackson. She asked Joel if that meant they were close to Jackson County.
Means we're close to Jackson City, right?
And Joel answered that it probably did, but he didn't know for sure as he hadn't been here before. But that if they could find the town, it'd probably be a good place to scavenge for food. Seeing no other way to continue forward, the pair carefully started climbing down the hillside toward the river at the bottom. And to their pleasant surprise, after only a few more hours of walking, they arrived at Jackson. What was weird was that even though Jackson was small, it was entirely surrounded by a wall with barbed wire. From Joel's experience, the government just ordered civilians living in smaller towns to evacuate to the quarantine zones in the bigger cities. So this couldn't have been done by the military. Coming closer to the gates, he thought he was seeing things. It was still daytime, so it was hard to tell, but he could swear he saw the streetlights towering above the wall being on. It wasn't giving him a good feeling. He told a now even more hungry Ellie that they should lay low until nighttime to figure out what to do, who disappointedly agreed. A few hours later, after nightfall, they could both clearly see that Jackson indeed had functioning electricity. It was lit up like a beacon in the surrounding darkness. Ellie whispered and asked Joel what they should do. Not wanting to walk in on another town full of hunters, he didn't really know. He said that they should sit tight a little while longer and try to find out more about the people living there. After around 20 minutes, the gate slightly opened for the first time that day, and a silhouette walked out a few meters. Not seeming like the hunter type, Joel decided it was time to introduce themselves. But after walking only a few meters forward, he heard a voice and a gun cocking, telling them to stop and put their weapons down. Not having any other option, they slowly put their guns on the ground. The voice continued talking in a disgusted voice that bandits like them are a black mark on the world. Joel told the voice that they weren't bandits and they were just passing through. After a short moment of silence, the voice confusedly said, "Holy shit." Joel slowly turned around and didn't believe his eyes. There was Tommy. His brother, who he hadn't seen in 20 years, a blonde woman and a few other armed survivors. The woman asked Tommy if he knew Joel, and he just responded that he's his brother.
He's my goddamn brother.
Tommy lowered his gun and stepped forward and hugged Joel. After a few seconds he backed out and looked at him and jokingly said Joel had gotten old.
You're fucking old.
The blonde woman introduced herself as Maria, Tommy's wife. Tommy said that they were just coming back from a nearby hydro power plant that they had gotten running again to get power to Jackson, and had mistaken Joel and Ellie for being part of another group of bandits trying to steal from them. Joel jokingly thanked them for not killing them, and all of them went into the town through the gate. Joel and Ellie were offered a guest house of their own and some food. After a day's rest and probably eating, Joel went out to find his brother at the town hall. he figured he could spend some time to catch up before he and Ellie moved on. Tommy agreed, and they went to his and Maria's house and sat down to talk. Joel, intrigued by how Tommy survived, asked what happened that night all those years ago. Tommy, sounding surprised himself, responded that after he and Rachel continued to the military checkpoint, he managed to push off the runner that had pinned him to the ground and make a run for another road, where he eventually got picked up by a military rescue team, which he rode with to a nearby evacuation point. After a few moments of silence, he asked Joel where and what Rachel was up to these days. Joel, rather not bringing up his own past, answered only with that she had passed and wanted to move on. Having stirred up old wounds and feelings, he tried steering the conversation in another direction. Tommy must have realized that he had not moved on yet and didn't pry any further. Joel continued by asking his brother if he knew where he could find the Fireflies. Tommy nodded and said that he did. He had, in fact, joined up with the Fireflies a few months into the outbreak and ran with them for a few years, but left due to disagreeing with their brutal methods of fighting Fedra, but stopped himself halfway into the story and asked why Joel wanted to find them, to which Joel simply said that Ellie was immune.
She's immune.
Taken a bit aback, Tommy responded by saying, "I see." He followed up by asking if Joel knew where the University of Eastern Colorado was, and Joel nodded. Sighing over the whole thing with Rachel, he continued by saying that just before he left, the science building on campus served as their lab, and would be his bet on where they'd find the Fireflies. Wanting to get out of the awkward and uncomfortable situation, Joel said great, and that he and Ellie would leave the next morning and went back to their guest house. As soon as he closed the door to the little cabin, Joel laid down on the bed, anger and sadness over Rachel in combination with the vivid memory of the deaths of Henry and Sam flowing around in his mind. Ellie was still out with Maria doing something. As he laid on the bed, he began reflecting on all that had happened, and slowly started to realize how attached he'd become to Ellie, who wasn't supposed to be more than simple cargo. Henry and Sam may have been brothers, but seeing how Henry reacted by losing Sam made him worry that he'd end up in the same situation if that ever happened to him. Another tragic loss on his conscience would crush him. No. To save himself, he had to get rid of Ellie. Tommy knew where the Firefly base was. Maybe he could convince him to take Ellie there if he got the payment. At this point, he didn't even care. He just wanted to be done with it and get to some place he could lay low. Before turning off the light, he decided he was going to talk to Tommy the first thing in the morning about it. A few hours later, Joel woke up by the late summer morning sun shining him right in the face through the window. Ellie was lying on the bed at the other end of the room, still sleeping. If he could avoid waking her up, he could just go to Tommy, tell him what to do without the sentimental stuff of saying goodbye, and just be on his way. He picked up his bag and gun and silently exited the house. A few minutes later, he'd arrived at Tommy's house. He knocked, and a recently awake Tommy answered the door. He made his argument, and after a heated discussion between Tommy and Maria, Tommy eventually agreed. He told Joel he could go to the armory and tell them Tommy sent him to grab some gear. Joel said his goodbyes and started walking in the direction of the armory. But only a few steps later, Tommy called him from over his porch.
Joel!
Confused, Joel asked what was going on. To his surprise, a guard had seen Ellie stealing a horse from the stable and riding out into the wilderness.
That girl of yours, she took one of our horses and rode off.
Damn it. Which way?
Come on.
Tommy quickly got dressed and ran out to Joel. Joel asked which way the stables was, and Tommy told him to follow him. 5 minutes later, they were outside the gate, following the tracks of Ellie's horse. Tommy raised his voice and asked through the wind if Ellie usually pulled these things. Joel, realizing she must have woken up and followed him and heard him make the deal with Tommy, just swore under his breath for an answer. After a few minutes of riding, the brothers arrived at a point where the remnants of a big landslide covered the road, blocking the path forward. The tracks had disappeared a while back, so they backtracked to pick up the trail again. Joel asked Tommy if there was some place nearby Ellie could have gone to. After thinking a short while, he said that there was an old highway just on the other side of the woods leading up to an old shopping mall. The Jackson settlers often used it for salvaging materials to build and repair things with. As they continued their journey through the forest, Joel began thinking on if he really was doing the right thing. What was the point of running away? There was no place to go. No one to go back to. Why abandon Ellie, the only one left really caring about him? He doubted his decision for a moment, but like a devil on his shoulder, the memory of Henry shooting his infected brother came rushing through his mind and made him stay on course. He'd find Ellie, leave her with Tommy, and be on his way. That was that. As they approached the old run-down mall after following Ellie's trail on the highway for a while, Tommy called out Joel's name and signaled him with his hand to stop. Thinking there would be bandits or infected ahead, he reached for his revolver. But when he looked up ahead, he saw what Tommy had made him stop for. An entire family of deer were standing in the overgrown parking lot, feeding on the grass. It was a weird change of pace from all the violence and despair he'd been through the last few months, and almost felt serene. It didn't last for very long, because a few moments later both of them and the deer heard the distant neighing of presumably Ellie's stolen horse. The deer ran away and he and Tommy upped their pace toward the entrance of the mall. The automatically opening glass doors had long since broken and fallen over, leaving a hole big enough for them to ride through. The mall was a few stories high with a big empty space in the middle, leaving room for all sorts of vegetation to grow inside. Just up ahead from the entrance was Ellie's horse, tethered to an old bench. But Ellie herself was nowhere to be seen. Joel yelled her name,
Ellie!
and to his surprise, she answered. From what seemed like a floor or two up, she proclaimed that she was there.
I'm up here.
Sighing to himself, he told Tommy to wait where he was and keep watch as he headed for one of the broken escalators leading up to the second floor. He found Ellie sitting outside an old magazine store, reading, or at least trying to, some sort of magazine or comic as if nothing had happened. Almost confounded, she asked Joel how the latest about famous people could be so important to everyone back in his time. Not feeling up for small talk, Joel just told her to get up and follow him. Looking up from the magazine, Ellie, with a touch of disappointment in her voice, asked what would happen if she said no. Annoyed, Joel asked her if she even realized what her life meant, and pointed out how dangerous and stupid this stunt was. Ellie put the magazine aside and looked down, sighed, and said that both of them must be disappointed in each other then. Feeling a slight sensation of guilt brewing, Joel brashly asked what Ellie wanted from him, which Ellie seemed to notice as she immediately asked him to admit that he always wanted to get rid of her. Taken a bit off guard, Joel went quiet for a second, trying to figure out what to say, before responding that Tommy was much better suited for getting her to the Fireflies. But halfway through his sentence, Ellie interrupted him and asked what he was so afraid of, following up by pointing out that she couldn't end up like Sam, which had been one of the primary reasons Joel wanted out in the first place. Looking away, Joel pointed out how many close calls they'd had so far, but Ellie just deflected by saying that they seemed to be doing fine so far. Frustration, in combination with him knowing Ellie was right, Joel burst out that she would be doing even better with Tommy. Thinking they were done talking, he started walking towards the escalator. After a few seconds of silence, Ellie pointed out that she wasn't her. Joel stopped right away and growled "what" for a response. She said that she'd eavesdropped on Joel when he and Tommy talked and heard about Rachel, but Joel cut her off, barely holding himself together, and told her she was treading on very thin ice. Ellie said she was sorry about Rachel, but that she had lost people too. Joel, boiling with emotions at this point, told her that she had no idea what loss was. Ellie, with a trembling voice and tears forming in her eyes, responded that everyone that she had ever cared about had either died or left her, except Joel. She continued by telling Joel saying that she'd be safer with someone else wasn't true, because she'd just be more scared. Joel looked at her, paused for a moment before saying that she was right. She was right, that he wasn't her dad, and that they would go their separate ways. Before Ellie could respond, Tommy came rushing up the escalator, telling them it was time to go. The noise had attracted several infected, who were now swarming toward the mall. The trio ran down to the bottom floor, jumped on their horses, and made their escape. Tommy took point and led them on a different way than the one they came. One of the signs on the side of the highway was still readable. It said something about a Jackson County hydroelectric power plant. No one said anything, but that's where Joel assumed they were going. The ride felt like it took months. The air almost seemed heavier after his argument with Ellie. A storm of feelings and thoughts were raging in Joel's mind. On the one hand, the vivid memories of both Henry and Sam and Rachel were torturing him into wanting to go through with his plan of just leaving everything behind. But on the other hand, the guilt of leaving Ellie, another daughter, behind, and how what she had said at the mall made sense was pulling him in the other direction. An eternity later, they arrived at the gates of the Jackson power plant, which now, during the late evening, was basking in light from floodlights and repurposed streetlights. As Tommy jumped off his horse to open for them to go in, Joel asked him where he said that the Firefly base was.
Where is this lab of theirs?
Ellie lifted her head in what seemed like cautious excitement. On the horse in front of him, Tommy turned around, confused. He said that he had already said so earlier, but repeated that they were using the University of Eastern Colorado as their base, and what was once the science building as a lab.
It's all the way out, University of Eastern Colorado. It's in the science building. Looks like a giant mirror, you can't miss it.
Joel looked at his brother and said that he'd hold on to the horse he was on and told Ellie to return the one she stole to Tommy and get up behind him.
Ellie, get off your horse. Give it on back to Tommy.
She enthusiastically obliged and jumped up behind Joel. Tommy asked if he was sure about this, and asked him to come in and at least discuss it first.
Come back to town, let's discuss it at least.
But Joel, having made up his mind, said it was already settled.
You know me, my mind's all made up.
Before they left, Tommy told them there was a place for them in Jackson if they wanted to stay. Joel said he'd make sure to remember that and started riding off in the direction of the University of Eastern Colorado. Okay, so this part is actually fairly similar to the game we got, except for the power plant and Jackson itself being switched. And well, the ranch scene was a mall scene. Now, some of the post-its on the very left are cut off and kind of hard to read. I can't really figure out what this one in quotes says, for example. I can see that it says town and that it's powered, and I assume this one says meet up with Tommy. Other than that, there isn't really a lot to talk about. I don't know if I would have preferred this version to the one in the real game. It would definitely have been very cool to see Jackson up close, but that's gonna be a thing in part 2 now, so it's not too bad we missed out on it here. And besides, if that would have happened in part 1, we would have missed out on a really good factions map. It's interesting to see though, that the locations we do see here in this sequence almost all ended up being used in different ways and parts of the game. The mall we got to see 2 of in Left Behind, and I'm glad for that because both the Colorado Mountain Plaza and Liberty Gardens were really cool locations. The highway we at least have part of when we enter Salt Lake City. I mean, you could count the tunnel, which is technically part of a highway, I guess, as one too, which are also really cool locations. And that is one of the most stressful and intense locations in the entire game. And it manages to be terrifying even though it's set during daytime. And then of course we also have the power plant, which replaced the whole Jackson sequence. Anyways, I know I said there would be discussion after every segment, but I'm basically scraping the bottom of the barrel for stuff to discuss here. Which is okay, because that's all we have time for today anyways. But don't worry, more episodes are coming soon. Or they're already out if you're watching this in the future. And I promise, the next one will have a much longer discussion segment. What do you think of having an entire, mostly peaceful, non-action section of the game taking place in Jackson? Would it have worked? Do you think I did a decent enough job of recreating and filling out the blanks of the storyboard? Tell me in the comments down below and let's discuss it. And until next time, have a great day.